Coming up on Arirang News, U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says she expects last month's spike in inflation to last through the end of the year. But another inflation concern is the Biden administration's reported budget proposal worth $6 trillion. South Korea will aim to give first vaccine doses to another 9 million people next month, which would mean a quarter of the population has had a first dose, keeping the country on track to herd immunity by this fall. And as South Korea gets ready to host the P4G Summit on climate change this weekend, Seoul hosts expert forums on eco-friendly business and protecting the planet's biodiversity. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thanks for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The new U.S. trade representative spoke on the phone Thursday with China's top trade negotiator in their first phone call under the Biden administration. No details about precisely what issues they discussed, but the U.S. side said it explained what it called the administration's worker-centered policies. Kim Hyo-sun reports.
The top trade negotiators of Washington and Beijing have spoken over the phone, the first call between the two since President Biden took office. Without disclosing specific details, China's foreign ministry said the talks between U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and Chinese Vice Premier Liu He were based on mutual respect.
The two sides held candid, practical and constructive exchanges in the spirit of equality and mutual respect. The two sides agreed that developing bilateral trade is very important, exchanged views on each other's concerns, and consented to continue to maintain communication.
In a separate statement, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative said Tai laid out the guiding principles of the Biden administration's worker-centered trade policy and raised issues of concern. Both Washington and Beijing said they agreed to continue negotiations. The conversation comes amid Washington's continued pressure on China, not only in the economic sector, but also with President Biden calling for a probe into the origin of COVID-19. Tai has been strongly urging China to start implementing the Phase 1 trade deal signed by the two countries early last year. She says Beijing needs to up its purchases of U.S. agricultural goods, manufactured products, energy, and services. Kim Hyo-sun, Arirang News.
With the P4G Summit on climate change coming up this weekend, South Korea has designated this as Green Future Week and is hosting a series of forums on the subject of climate change. On the fourth day today, business leaders met to look for ways to accelerate green growth in the private sector. Kim Jae-hee reports.
Businesses are joining forces to reduce their carbon footprint. At the business forum held online on Thursday night Korea time, company leaders put their heads together in a bid to stimulate the spread of eco-friendly business models and to improve sustainable management. The chairman of the Korea Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Choi Tae-won, proposed 3 mechanisms to accelerate green growth. They are the measurement of respective firms' environmental performance, incentives for businesses' efforts towards sustainable governance, and global collaboration.
Today, I have 3 keywords: measure, incentivize, and collaborate. Companies must address environmental issues with a strong sense of commitment. It'll be the new entrepreneurship that's demanded during the new era.
Corporations share their inclusive green transition strategies to learn from each other's experiences. Apple revealed its joint effort with its suppliers in reducing emissions from electricity, business travel, and even their employees' commute by transitioning to renewable energy.
Last year, we announced Apple's most ambitious environmental commitment to date, to become carbon neutral for our entire supply chain and the lifetime use of our devices by 2030. Thanks to work with teams across Apple and our supply chain, we've already made significant progress on this goal.
South Korean tech giant Samsung Electronics presented its ESG practices and encouraged other firms to start their green journey as well.
Samsung Electronics fulfilled its promise of using 100% renewable electricity in its branches in the US, China, and Europe by the end of 2020. We're pushing to reduce carbon emissions by developing energy-saving chips like low-power SSDs and low-power DRAM.
IKEA said it's possible to decouple business growth and greenhouse gases, stating that it has grown 13.7% from 2016 to 2020, while reducing its greenhouse gas emissions by 14%.
The forum concluded with a consensus on the business community's obligation to pursue green growth and renewed calls for ongoing global dialogue on climate change. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
And staying with the Green Future Week sessions, experts and ordinary citizens joined an online discussion on Thursday to emphasize the importance of biodiversity. They proposed potential ways to help natural habitats recover. Choi Won-jong reports.
Heartbreaking footage of animals suffering or at risk of going extinct was shown during Thursday's session of the 2021 P4G Seoul Summit, Green Future Week. With the title of Hope for the Future, Biodiversity Restoration, the session aimed to point out what biodiversity is and why it matters to everyone. A former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that the pandemic was a clear sign that we need to rethink our relationship with nature.
It would not be an exaggeration to say that the newly emerging viruses are the warnings from outraged nature to humanity. The best vaccine for disease prevention would be response to climate change, coupled with biodiversity recovery.
One expert explained that unless we increase the size of wild habitats so that more animals can live comfortably, pandemics could become much more common.
That's not going to happen. Then chances are we're going to suffer this kind of epidemics again and again, and probably much more frequently.
A special guest from the Antarctic attended the session through a live connection, describing how biodiversity has been affected by human activities in the region.
Reckless overfishing has reduced the population of krill, one of the main food sources of penguins. Much efforts are needed to stop overfishing.
To prevent further loss of biodiversity, experts suggesting that humanity needs to shift its mindset.
We need to understand humanity as very much embedded in the web of life. And we need to begin to see nature not as a cost, but rather as an engine of prosperity, as the system within which we derive many, many dimensions of our well-being.
Experts say biodiversity and humans are inseparable, and people need to consider the consequences that their actions have for the future of the planet. Choi Won-jong, Arirang News.
And in other news, to help the economy recover, South Korea is extending a 30% tax cut on car purchases for another 6 months. It was supposed to expire at the end of June, but Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki announced today that it will last until the end of the year. South Korea's economic recovery has been helped by strong exports of cars, but domestic demand has been weak. Last month, sales were down 6.6% on year. The South Korean government has officially designated the Financial Services Commission as the agency responsible for supervising and regulating the cryptocurrency market. Also today, the FSC's crackdown on crypto-related crimes was extended for 3 months until September. On a separate note, the government has reaffirmed that it will start taxing capital gains from crypto trading next year as planned at a rate of 20%. Those who make more than 2.5 million Korean won, or around $2,200 in the course of a year, will have to report it and pay taxes on it from May 2023. Officials in the U.S. have been maintaining that the spike in inflation we saw last month will be temporary. Now, Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has spelled that out in a little more detail, saying she thinks it'll last through the end of the year. Some are concerned also that the Biden administration's budget proposal to come Friday, worth around $6 trillion, will mean more inflation, but Yellen said she doesn't think so. Kim Sung-min reports.
U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said Thursday that the above-normal inflation in the U.S. will last until the end of this year. Testifying to a virtual hearing of the House Appropriations Subcommittee, Yellen said she believes that the recent inflation will be temporary but will last for several more months. The U.S. in the month of April saw consumer prices surge 4.2% on year, the sharpest rise since 2008. Yellen attributed the volatility in prices to shifts in consumer spending in the pandemic and supply chain bottlenecks. Republicans have seized on rising prices to criticize the Biden spending proposals, but Yellen rejected claims that the administration's plan for long-term spending would accelerate inflation. She was speaking a day before the Biden administration is expected to propose a government budget worth around $6 trillion. Citing people familiar with the plan, the Wall Street Journal reports that it'll put the country on a path to spend $8.2 trillion annually by the end of 2031. That would bring U.S. federal spending to its highest sustained level since World War II. This will be the first budget under President Biden, who wants to boost spending on infrastructure, education, healthcare, and social services. His plan means sharply higher taxes on corporations and the wealthy, which officials say will make up for the higher spending within 15 years. Though the government will continue to be in the red until then, they say the spending will raise the economy's productivity in the long term. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thank you for coming on today.
Good afternoon.
Well, overnight on Wall Street, we saw the Dow Jones with a solid gain after U.S. jobless claims came in better than expected. Tech stocks were off, though, so the S&P was a little more subdued and the Nasdaq was flat. Mr. Yu, take us through the global markets.
Yes, if you look at the overall market, it continued to show quite reasonable rising trend despite the concern about the inflationary pressure. Overall, U.S. market did quite okay. And in general, the overall major indices are all going up quite nicely. However, though, Nasdaq was slightly down, but actually pretty much flat. And Dow Jones, which is the more of the value stocks or inside of the Dows, and it actually did quite well out of all the indexes. And also, if you look at small caps, it actually gained by 1%. I think that this is because most investors are pretty much cheering up the strong labor market data that came out. American filing new claims for unemployment benefits dropped by 38,000 to 406,000 last week. This is the lowest level since the pandemic first hit the labor market in March 2020. Of course, still it's far away from the 4 weeks average of about 21,000 level, but nevertheless, it seems to show continuous improvement. Because of this kind of news, we did see the 10-year government bond rate to rise to 1.6% plus. Clearly, the inflation numbers are the most important thing at the current point in time, and investors are watching quite closely of April PCE numbers, which seems to show that inflation measures are jumping up to about 2.9% in April. That also reflected in the most of the commodity prices, and the oil prices were hitting well above $67 per barrel. We think that the growth stock and the value stock will both do quite reasonably well in the future as economy continue to show recovery.
And here in Korea, there was a nice gain today in the markets. The Kospi rising almost to 3,200 in the session, but not quite. The Kosdaq at almost 980. Investors feeling good about the direction the economy is going. Tell us about the Korean market.
Yes, Kospi was up by 0.73%, and it hit 3,188 territories. In the past 2 days, it was kind of mediocre performance. Really didn't do much, but it did recover nicely on the third day. And Kosdaq was up by about 0.35%. Main reason for these kind of rises were because foreign investors as well as institutional investors were coming back to the market. We did see 13 days highest level of net buying by the foreign investors. Foreign investors net bought about 139.5 billion, which is highest level since 10th of this month. In terms of actual short selling amount, it did decline reasonably. That has resulted into Korean won dollar rate to stabilize, and Korean won to dollar rate is at 1115.5, which is actually appreciating of Korean won. That means that foreign investors' interest is still there, and this is actually reasonably good positive indication. However, we did see interest rate being fairly reasonably high for Korea. It did hit 2.12% for 10-year bond rate, which is well above 1.61% of U.S. And Bank of Korea have mentioned that they might raise interest rate in case the economy does recover very strongly, as we are seeing right now. Clearly, indication is that the net export numbers are very strong. That is resulting into very positive economic growth rate, and that has resulted into somewhat of an overheating in a sense, and therefore Bank of Korea is considering possible rate hike within this year. However, though, because the economic recovery is very strong and the earnings growth rates are very strong, interest rate rise is not necessarily that negative, given the fact that earnings growth are very strong.
Yeah, let's stay on that subject for a minute. You mentioned the Korean government 10-year bond at 2.1 and the 10-year Treasury in the U.S. It was below 1.6, but now it's above that level. And of course, that's a considerable rise, if you remember, before when we started the year at below 1%. So investors all around the world are wondering what would happen if the Fed were to actually start raising rates. What do you think would happen if rates go up in the markets?
Right. Always the interest rate rise is negative news for the equity market. However, if you look at in general, we don't think that the Fed is going to touch the interest rate until 2023, despite that inflation pressure is there. I think the first step would be tapering, which means that the net purchase of the bonds buying program would reduce in the future. However, we think that the government will allow the inflation to rise because that results into the government debt level as a percent of GDP to decline. We need a reasonable inflation number rather than not seeing an inflation or deflation. That is very important. Of course, the long-term interest rate is most likely to gradually rise as we expect as the government continues to put efforts to improve the global economy. And we do expect the U.S. interest rate of 10-year bond rate to go up to as high as 2% to 2.5% over the next couple of years as the economy recovers. However, though, that is not necessarily a very high number relative to the return on equity that has been generated for the U.S. companies. Also, that also fits into the Korea. Korea's interest rate will be always higher than U.S. Because clearly Korea is not the base currency, and you need to have interest rate higher than U.S. in order to see foreign net purchase of Korean assets rather than selling it, including the government bonds. We do think that the Korea's interest rate is probably more keen to rise higher because we are seeing much stronger growth of export and stronger growth of GDP than U.S. for the time being. However, though, there is a possible pressure because of the high level consumer debt. But in any case, overall, interest rate is going to be gradually going up rather than fast pace of rising. If that's the case, then we don't think that it's going to be that much negative for the equity market performance over the next couple of years.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, and have a great weekend.
Thank you very much. You too.
South Korea is aiming to give first vaccine doses to another 9 million people in June, which would mean a quarter of the population will have been inoculated by the end of the month. These people are getting the AstraZeneca vaccine. The government will also set up 1,500 vaccination centers in preparation for rolling out the Pfizer vaccine in July. Min Soo-kyun reports.
South Korea is speeding up its inoculation program to ensure 13 million people get their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccine in the first half of this year. To meet that goal, the country plans to inoculate 9 million people in June. This means, on average, about 300,000 people have to be vaccinated every day. On Thursday, over 711,000 people were vaccinated, the largest daily figure since the launch of the vaccination program in February. Of them, around 657,000 received their first shot and about 54,000 had their second jab. So far, a total of 9.1% of the total population have now received their first shots, while 4% have completed their 2 doses. Health officials are reassuring the public that vaccine schedules will be made as planned.
Yesterday, 1,069,000 doses of AstraZeneca vaccines were supplied, and 828,000 more doses arrived today. A total of 11.64 million batches have been delivered out of the 18.38 million batches set for the first half of this year.
Starting July, the government will start to inoculate 50 to 59 years old, as well as teachers, high school seniors, and others preparing for the National College entrance exam this year. Health authorities will also set up around 1,500 more vaccination centers for Pfizer's vaccine, capable of storing and offering doses to the public. To ensure no vaccines are wasted, the government on Thursday kicked off a program allowing people over 30 years old to get inoculated with leftover vaccines. A total of 62,000 people received no-show vaccines on the first day of its launch. Most of those have signed up on the KDCA's reserve list website, but more than 4,000 people received their jabs after making reservations using Naver or Kakao app. Min Soo-kyun, Arirang News.
President Moon Jae-in has reshuffled a number of posts at the Blue House, including that of press secretary. His new senior secretary for public communication is Park Soo-hyun, a former Blue House spokesperson. Announcing the reshuffle, Moon's chief of staff, Yoo Young-min, said it's meant to give fresh momentum to what is now the administration's final year. The other appointments are Bang Jung-gyun, vice president of Sangji University, as senior secretary for civic and social agenda. Also, Nam Myung-suk, ambassador to Norway, will be the president's new advisor for economic affairs. President Moon also replaced his secretaries handling local autonomy and balanced development, institutional reform and job creation, as well as culture and gender equality and family affairs. The U.S. Secretary of Defense and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs say that the Biden administration is going to make diplomacy the focus when dealing with North Korea. They say they recognize the regional and global threats posed by the regime, but diplomacy has to be the way. Kim Ji-yeon has the details.
Top defense and military chiefs in the U.S. testified that Washington will put diplomacy at the forefront when dealing with North Korea, despite concerns over the North's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. In a written testimony to the House Subcommittee on Defense released on Thursday, U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin stated that Pyongyang poses an increasing threat to regional allies and partners and has ambitions to be able to strike the U.S. mainland. He said that by leading with diplomacy, the U.S. will continue to work to mitigate North Korea's destabilizing and provocative behavior and maintain peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Army General Mark Milley, also stated in his written testimony to the subcommittee that North Korea possesses the technical capacity to present a real danger to the U.S. mainland, as well as U.S. allies and partners across the Indo-Pacific. Milley said the North continues to enhance its ballistic missile capability at the expense of its citizens and peace on the Korean peninsula, adding that it shows no signs of giving up its efforts to bolster its military capability. The two chiefs also expressed the threat posed by China. Austin said China's ambitions are not only aimed at economic supremacy, but also aimed at changing the regional order in a way that will hurt democratic values and weaken human rights in the free and open Indo-Pacific. Milley also said China is the #1 security issue and cited a need to maintain a relationship with China of rivalry, but not coalition. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
North Korea's new ambassador to China met today with China's foreign minister, and they reportedly agreed to strengthen their country's traditionally strong ties. The timing of their meeting is noteworthy since it came less than a week after the South Korea-U.S. summit in Washington. Kim Dami reports.
China's foreign minister has vowed to deepen ties with North Korea and build on decades of cooperation during talks with the regime's new ambassador to China. Echoing Wang Yi's sentiments during their meeting in Beijing Thursday, Lee Dong-nam said it was an honor to be appointed envoy at a time when bilateral relations are at a new high. The pledge comes just a few days after the summit between the leaders of South Korea and the U.S., and watchers say Beijing is keeping the Seoul-Washington alliance in check by highlighting its ties with the North. Not wearing face masks, the two met for the first time since February when Lee was appointed succeeding Ji Jae-ryong in the first such appointment in a decade. Lee served as a North trade minister from 2008 to 2016 before becoming a vice premier in the regime's cabinet in 2019. Earlier in March, Chinese leader Xi Jinping and North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un exchanged letters to reaffirm their traditional alliance to address hostile forces. Kim's letter to Xi also came at a critical time as the Biden administration was expected to unveil its new North Korea policy and followed a visit to Seoul by top U.S. officials. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.